Welcome to Chapter 2 as it relates to general psychology, which happens to be the biological issues that are related to psychological practice. I'd like to start by explaining a story that occurred way back in 1921. A fellow by the name of Otto Louis put together two living hearts. Actually, how he did this was by placing both of those hearts in a fluid bath that kept them beating. He stimulated the vagus nerves of one of the hearts, which is a bundle of nerves that serves the parasympathetic nervous system. It causes a reduction in the heart's rate of beating. Now, the substance was released by the nerve of the first heart and was transported through the fluid to the second heart. Now, the second heart reduced its state of beating. The substance released from the vagus nerve of that first heart was later identified as acetylcholine, one of our significant neurotransmitters. For example, another particular drug called curare is a poison that was originally discovered by South American Indians who put it on the tips of their darts that they would shoot from their blowguns. What we've now learned about curare is that it blocks acetylcholine receptors. What it does, it makes the body paralyzed, at least as it relates to internal organs. The victim then is unable to breathe and will eventually die. As another example, the substance in the venom of black widow spiders will stimulate the release of acetylcholine at the synapses. More commonly, botulism toxin, which is found in improperly canned foods, blocks the release of acetylcholine at the synapses and has a deadly effect. It takes less than 1/1,000,000th of a gram of this toxin to kill a person. Finally, a deficit of acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's disease, which afflicts a high percentage of older adults. Now, many other neurotransmitters have been identified since 1921, and there is ever increasing evidence that supports their importance as it relates to human behavior. Psychoactive drugs affect consciousness because of their effects on the synaptic transmissions. For example, cocaine and the other amphetamines prolong the action of certain neurotransmitters, and opiates imitate the action of natural neurotransmitters called endorphins. Now, it appears that the neurotransmitters dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin are associated with some of the most serious forms of mental and psychological concerns. So let's take a look at some of the initial biological concepts related to the practice of psychology, and we're going to start with a basic building block. We're going to start with a neuron. The neuron is basically a single cell nerve cell that combines itself with other neurons, in a manner of speaking, to help formulate neuronic networks that eventually lead to the process of not only thinking but action and physical activity. Now, neurons at the end or at the edge of the cell body will have dendrites, which are like little fingers that stick out and away from the soma, or the body part of the neuron. There's probably an example or a picture of one in your textbook. Now, what happens after that is that you'll see in that particular picture, assuming there is one, that there is another dendrite that's a bit longer, and it has some sort of covering on it. The covering is referred to as myelin. In theory, we call it the myelin sheath, which is like a fatty substance that surrounds the axon. Now, it acts as an insulator for the axon, just like the insulation works on an electrical wire to keep you from being shocked. It also helps to increase the action potential of the neuron, and we'll get to the action potential in just a moment. Now, the myelin not only insulates, but it protects axons, and it speeds along the neural conduction. And there are different types of neurons. There are afferent neurons, which collect messages from the sense organs. Efferent neurons carry messages from the brain and spinal cord to the various muscles and glands. Interneurons carry messages from one neuron to another, and mirror neurons are involved in mimicking the behavior of other neurons. Glial cells, which are actually cells that are somewhat like a glue substance, provide separation and insulation for neurons that keep them separated from one another. Now, let me tell you, as it relates to the neurons themselves, let's talk about the neural impulse. When a neuron is at rest, It is negatively charged inside and positively charged on the outside. When it's stimulated, the charge reverses. What this is called is action potential. Neurons fire as a result of this action potential in what's called an all or nothing manner. Now, what that means as it relates to the all or none law is that an axon, which is part of a neuron, will build up enough electrical energy to fire, or it won't fire. It either is all in or is all out. It can't do both. If it doesn't have enough energy to fire, then it sits dormant. Now, although it's generally the case that most neurons have an electrical signal that must first be converted to a chemical signal in order to excite or inhibit another neuron, that's not always the case. Some neurons have what we call gap junctions, which connect their intracellular fluids, and this means that the electrical signal can flow directly from one neuron to another. Unlike chemical synapses, most electrical synapses formed by the gap junctions are bidirectional, and that means that electrical signals can travel in both directions through the gap junctions. Gap junctions also contain gates, which can be closed to prevent the electrical signal from being passed into the neighboring neuron. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to these rules. That first exception was the gap junction. A second rule states that axons always synapse on the dendrite. Now, there are some exceptions, and they're called axoaxonic and axosomatic synapses. Axons can form from synapses on all parts of a postsynaptic neuron. Synapses located in the soma, or the cell body, of a neuron are often inhibitory. In other words, the transmitters released at these axonomic synapses make it harder for the postsynaptic neuron to reach the threshold for generating an action potential. Now, when an axon synapses on the axon of another neuron, it's called an axoaxonic synapse. Now, because these synapses usually occur near the end of the axon, they have no effect on whether the postsynaptic cell generates an axon potential or not. Instead, an axoaxonic synapse will usually modulate how much neurotransmitter is released from the postsynaptic neuron. Another rule is that action potentials only travel in one direction. The exception is the back-propagating action potential. Action potentials begin at the axonic hillock, where the axon emerges from the soma, and from there the action potential travels down the axon and away from the soma. At the same time, however, a back-propagating action potential can travel from the axon hillock through the soma and into the dendrites. Back-propagating action potentials are thought to affect the functioning of receptors located in the soma and the dendrites. Now, after hearing information related to the cell body as well as axons and dendrites, I'm going to explain to you what's called the synapse. Now, there is a space that exists between dendrites and other neurons and their dendrites as neurons gather together. And what happens is that electrochemical transactions take place between those dendrites as well as those axons. After an axon is fired, the information that is sent from the axon is received by other dendrites and then processed to give the body an idea of what it's supposed to do. Now, the space in which that transaction takes place is called the synapse. Now, the synaptic vesicles will release the neurotransmitter into the synapse. The neurotransmitter molecules fit into what are called receptor sites on another dendrite or cell body, and those neurotransmitters may be either excitatory or inhibitory, meaning that they will either tell the other neuron to do something or not to do something. Most neurotransmitters are then taken back into the synaptic vesicle. That's called the synaptic reuptake. This will become important in a few moments. Now, to give you an idea of the neurotransmitters that we're going to be discussing across the term, we'll talk about acetylcholine, which is related to Alzheimer's disease. Talk about glutamate, serotonin, which is implicated in many cases of depression. Dopamine, also implicated in depression as well as Parkinson's disease. Natural endorphins, or the natural morphine of the body. GABA is a neurotransmitter associated with hunger. as well as glycine. Now, one way to take a real good look and try to get an understanding of how the brain works is to look at the brain in a metaphorical way. In other words, I'll give you an example. We can use a metaphor like a toolbox, and it makes looking at the brain an easier project. So let's compare the brain, first of all, to an hydraulic model. Early thinkers such as Galen and Descartes described the brain as a pneumatic or a hydraulic system that relied on newfangled plumbing systems dominant during their lifetimes. Galen, for example, believed that the liver generated spirits or gases that flowed to the brain. Then they formed animal spirits there that flowed throughout the nervous system. Descartes explained it this way. He said that he was adding that information to the pineal gland, which at that time was considered the supposed residence of one's soul, and it acted on the animal's spirits to direct reasoning and other behaviors. In short, the brain was the septic tank. It stored, mixed, and directed the flow of spirit gases throughout the body for the purposes of behavior and action. I'm glad we've come up with better ways to describe it. They also have described the brain as mechanical or telephonic devices. As new technology came into being, of course, new ways of examining the brain also came into being. During the Industrial Revolution, for example, machine metaphors dominated, and in particular, the brain was conceived as a complex mechanical apparatus that involved, metaphorically speaking, levers, gears, trip hammers, and pulleys. During the 1920s, the brain developed into a slightly more sophisticated machine that resembled a switchboard. The new technology of the telephone provided a new metaphor. Inputs, patch cords, outputs, and busy signals dominated explanations of brain activity. Now, the metaphor, however, faltered by viewing the brain as a system that shut down periodically, especially if no one was dialing a number. We know now, of course, that the brain is always active. Another model that serves us well as a metaphor is the computerized model. In the late 1950s, metaphors for the brain relied on computer technology. We had input, output, memory, storage, information processing, circuitry. All of those were terms that seemed to be equally suited to talking about computer chips or neurons. Although perhaps a better metaphor than plumbing or telephones, the computer model eventually showed its shortcomings. As a descriptive device, however, the metaphor can at least suggest limits in our understanding and point us away to a profitable area of research. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of the brain, or at least one that I consider to be fascinating, is what's called neuroplasticity. The other word associated with neuroplasticity is neurogenesis. Now, neuroplasticity is a word that refers to the brain's ability to relocate structure and the function of certain types of cells. Neural networks then result from functional groupings of neurons. In everyday language, what happens is that neurons group themselves together, and in this process of plasticity, they adapt to certain movement or certain activities that some other part of the brain may require, but for some reason is not able to produce. One way to look at that would be to mention someone who's had a stroke. Sometimes individuals who have strokes will often not be able to speak initially for a certain amount of time. In some cases, the brain has to relearn how to speak. That would include the process of neuroplasticity. The brain can learn how to speak even if the original speaking parts have been harmed in some way. Other cells in the brain take over those particular categories. So again, that's neuroplasticity, the ability of certain parts of the brain to be malleable and to change. Now, neurogenesis is a little more interesting from the standpoint of the creation of new neurons. Now, what has come up as a result of that study is that stem cells hold the greatest promise of repairing damaged brain tissue. I'm sure many of you have seen the ancient commercial on television when they put a fried egg or put an egg on the sidewalk and it starts to fry, and they refer to it as your brain on drugs. In a similar way, The old adage was that when you were born with however many brain cells you had, and that was all you were going to get. There were no more, which is one of the reasons that many people cautioned against the use of any sort of illicit substance. You start burning up your brain cells, you don't have as many to work with. We know now that in some cases, sometimes brain cells reproduce themselves, which is of course an exciting research phenomenon that's occurring into the future. Now, one of the challenges with that is that the neurons that are necessary to do that sort of study usually come from stem cells that come from a baby's umbilical cord. Now just sit with that for a second. So a woman has a child and they remove part of the blood from the umbilical cord and store it in such a way, I'm assuming by significant freezing, that saves that blood and the cells therein in the offhand event that that child needs some sort of new type of cell. Now please understand, there are significant ethical issues that come up when we're talking about stem cell research. Lots of people have lots of things to say. There are political considerations, there are moral considerations, as well as social concerns. All of those matters are involved in the ideas related to stem cell research, which of course then is going to include the possibility of being able to create new brain cells. Now please also note that there is an awful lot of misinformation in the world about such things as stem cells. I'll give you the quotes from some important people. George W. Bush said in a speech in 2001, "While we must devote enormous energy to conquering disease, it is equally important that we pay attention to the moral concerns raised by the new frontier of human embryo stem cell research. Even the most noble ends do not justify any means." Bill Frist, in a speech in 2005, said, "I am pro-life. I believe human life begins at conception. I also believe that embryonic stem cell research should be encouraged and supported." Barack Obama, in March of 2009, said this, "The majority of Americans from across the political spectrum and of all backgrounds and beliefs have come to the consensus that we should pursue this research," the reference is to stem cells, "that the potential it offers is great, and with proper guidelines and strict oversight, the perils can be avoided." Again, there is an awful lot of misinformation out there about stem cells and stem cell research. Some people are going to question the scientific credentials of any of the individuals that I just mentioned, and it will be important for you to examine the evidence for yourself. If you get a wild itch, let me know and I'll provide you with some websites that have specific references to stem cell research. So now first, we've got a better idea of the neuron, how it works with the brain and certain aspects of the brain, including neurotransmitters, as well as the brain's possibility of being able to change how it works to some degree, as well as produce new cells. Now let's turn our attention to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of spinal cord and the brain. To begin, now the brain has a number of different parts. Not that I'm going to give you every single solitary piece of the brain or the area of the brain that handles whatever activity, but I will give you some. At the top of the spinal cord is called the hindbrain. Now, to use a very interesting word that some people get a little twitchy about, at the first stage of human evolution, in other words, the part of the brain that developed first was the hindbrain. It included, and still includes, the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla is the part of the brain that regulates breathing, heart rate, and other automatic functions in the body, like blood pressure. The pons helps the human body to sleep. It also helps with being awake, as well as dreaming. The cerebellum, which is that cluster of cells on the backside at the bottom, is the part of the brain that regulates balance as well as the coordination of movement. Now, what I'm telling you by talking about those three pieces of the brain is that the creature, whatever that was, the human creature we're going to say, that only possessed that kind of brain could not see. There were no eyes that were associated with that brain activity. So whatever creature that was simply existed and functioned to some degree or other, but we don't know to what extent. The midbrain was the second stage of the evolutionary process in human brain development. It includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the reticular formation. The midbrain directs incoming sensory messages to the higher centers of the brain, while the hypothalamus is associated with human drive, such as hunger, thirst, emotions, and the need for sex. The reticular formation is responsible for what we call arousal, in other words, one's tendency to be excited, as well as being alert. Now, the cerebrum, which contains the cerebral cortex, is kind of like the notion of a thinking cap. It is the outside layer of your brain that is divided into 4 specific lobes. The occipital lobe is located just above the cerebellum on the back part of your head. It contains the visual cortex. The optic nerves that move from the eye back to the occipital lobe help you understand what it is you're looking at. The parietal lobe is the set of lobes just in front of that, which is going to be somewhere along here. The parietal lobe contains the sensory cortex, which receives information about pressure, pain, touch, and temperature from everywhere in the body. Temporal lobes are the smaller lobes that exist above each ear. They contain the auditory cortex, as you might well assume. The frontal lobe is at the front of the human brain. It contains the motor cortex, which is responsible for making plans, what we call executive function, taking initiative, and thinking creatively. Now, association areas are found in all of the lobes, but particularly in the frontal lobes. Now, the limbic system is another piece. It includes the hippocampus and the amygdala. Both of those organs exist down toward the core center of your brain. The hippocampus plays an important role in the formation of new memories. It also helps to move memory into consolidated places, meaning that as we decide to keep certain memories, the hippocampus helps file them away in a more permanent fashion. The amygdala is a little almond-shaped organ that exists down there by the hippocampus, and it regulates one's emotions. It also establishes memories that are associated with those particular emotions. Now, continuing through the ideas of the brain itself, you need to understand hemispheric specialization. It's also called contralateral representation. And what that means is that the brain is divided into 2 halves, left half and a right half. It is tied together by a large bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum. Now, those hemispheres use that corpus callosum to communicate information to both sides of the brain. The left side of the brain appears to control language, writing, logical thought, analysis, and even mathematical ability. The right side of the brain is thought to process information globally and controls emotional expression, spatial perception, and the recognition of faces, patterns, melodies, and emotion. Now, information presented, and this is where this becomes important, information presented only to the left hemisphere of the brain can be spoken, but information only sent to the right side of the brain cannot. What that tells us is that there is a part of the left-hand side of the brain that regulates one's ability to speak. So information given to that part of the brain lets the person speak. Same information sent to the similar place or anywhere on the right hemisphere, the person cannot speak or understand that language. It speaks to 2 different areas. The first one's called Broca's area. The one at the back is called Wernicke's area. They refer to the ability to have expressive language or receptive language. We'll talk about those another time. But those 2 parts of the brain are only on the left side. and again, don't exist on the right. Now, just so you get an idea of how challenging it can be to understand some of the concepts related to the brain, I want to tell you about a fellow. His name was Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker, and through a very strange accident, part of a piece of steel that he was working with blew up and went through his face. And what it did is there's probably a picture of it in your book, but it went through one part of his face, through his frontal lobe, and came out the top of his head. He survived that accident, and they've come to understand that the reports that occurred, this particular accident, for example, let me see, where did that go? Forgotten the exact year. He died in 1860, so it would have been far before that. He was a younger man then. Anyway, his personality changed after his accident. The person didn't change, but certain ways of how he presented himself did change. And of course, we can only attribute that to the accident, but it also affected various parts of his brain, which leads us to understand how humans function a little better. Just bear in mind, the brain can survive all kinds of damage. There are occasions when too much damage, depending on the place that the damage is incurred, will kill someone. When someone hits a person on the back of the head just hard enough and just in the right place, a person dies. That's because the hindbrain gets damaged in some way and the body doesn't know how to breathe anymore. You can damage other parts of the body. Again, certain parts of the body are damaged as it relates to stroke, car accidents, or other brain traumas. And there are ways that individuals can learn how to reuse certain behaviors and certain things that they couldn't do as well as could do, relearn a bit later, depending on one's strength as well as one's ability to be neuroplastic. Now, we study the brain by using a number of different tools. We use an EEG, which is an electroencephalogram, that has electrodes that are placed on the scalp that are amplified and then viewed. In other words, it gives the technician information about where the brain is functioning and to what degree. A CAT scan or a CT scan is a computer-aided X-ray that shows the skull and the brain structure. An MRI scan uses a magnetic field, radio impulses, as well as a computer to create an image of the brain. The MEG and the MSI also use magnetic fields to get a clearer picture of the brain at work. A PET scan is used as a radioactive sugar is injected into the bloodstream, and they trace that dye. An fMRI allows researchers to look at other activities of the brain over a period of time. Now, I mentioned an MRI. One way to distinguish these is to remember this. An MRI gives you the pieces or the structure, pictures of the structure of the brain. An fMRI allows researchers to see where the blood flow is strongest, which will typically indicate where the action is taking place in the brain. For example, someone who has a condition called schizophrenia, there is a certain part of the brain that lights up, basically because of blood flow, when a person is encountering some sort of episode related to that schizophrenia. That's how they find those sorts of things. They light up. Now, remember that the spinal cord is made up of a long series of bundles and axons that are wrapped together in myelin. Motor neurons descend from the brain while sensory neurons ascend from the extremities and the other organs. There is a reflexive neural circuit that is required. It doesn't require any input from the brain, but the circuits are required to make everything work as it should. So that's the central nervous system. To divide that down a little bit further, we'll look at the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system includes the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system also has a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division. So the peripheral nervous system and the somatic, which is part of that, the somatic nervous system, contains the sensory pathway as well as the motor pathway. The autonomic nervous system, which is the other piece of the peripheral nervous system, contains the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Now, one of those divisions, in fact, it's the sympathetic, if I remember correctly. The sympathetic information is the part of the nervous system that tells the human body what it needs to do when it's dealing with fight or flight. It's the part of the body that turns the body on when the caveman or the cave woman needed to know if they were going to be eaten by the saber-toothed tiger or they could get up the tree before the tiger got there. It tells the brain what to do, and it all happens very quickly. When the sensory pathway, when the sympathetic nervous system engages, certain parts of the brain certain parts of the body turn off, other parts of the brain turn on. Bronchial tubes, for example, as well as lung capacity, increase so that the person can intake more air. The heart rate picks up to enable better speed. Muscle twitch and fibers related to muscles and whatnot are also increased, as well as their speed to create the possibility of quicker movement. Those sorts of ideas. There should be an illustration in your book that explains which specific parts the sympathetic nervous system turns on. Now, once the crisis has passed, whatever that happens to be, the parasympathetic nervous system then takes over and puts all of the organs back into their proper, not only order, but their ability to regulate things appropriately. In other words, bronchial tubes and lung capacity decrease. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system turns off your digestion, the parasympathetic nervous system turns it back on so that whatever food you have in there can then be processed, those sorts of ideas. So just take a look at that and get an idea of which one does what. It's important for you to know how they're all connected. And as our time together increases over the course of the term, you'll discover that I will go back and help you connect the dots between some of these other earlier concepts and the ones we encounter a little bit later, so that you can get a better, or at least a more clear picture of how all of these things connect. Let's take a look for a moment at the endocrine system, which is the system that deals with hormones. It includes the pituitary gland, which is just below the hypothalamus. It controls the levels of salt and water in the human system. In women, it also controls the onset of labor and lactation. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which helps us sleep. The thyroid gland, which is located right here, just inside the neck there, it controls metabolism by secreting thyroxine. The pancreas controls the level of sugar in the blood by secreting insulin as well as glucogens. The adrenal glands are little bitty, we'll just call them glands, little bitty glands that sit on top of either one of your kidneys. They control the release of cortisol and the stress reaction in the human body. Of course, the gonads, which includes ovaries in women and testes in men, are the parts of the body that secrete hormones to regulate sexual growth, activity, and even reproduction. Now, again, as part of the biological processes related to the brain, we also at least need to give a head nod to genes, evolution, and other notions related to behavior. Genetics in general, you're going to get a whole lot bigger amount of exposure in your anatomy classes for some of this stuff. But genes are the basic units of inheritance. Chromosomes, on the other hand, are the cellular bodies that carry those genes. DNA is the building block of your gene. There will be dominant genes as well as recessive genes. Pairings predict outcomes. Polygenic inheritance are multiple genes that contribute to a specific trait. The genotype is a unique genetic blueprint, while a phenotype is an outward expression of that trait. The human genome is the full complement of an organism's genetic material. The Human Genome Project is one that has been mapping the entire human genome for a number of years. From a behavioral perspective, We examine animal behavior genetics, and we use strain studies as well as selective studies. When we're talking about human behavior genetics, we deal with family studies, including the study of twins, both identical and fraternal. And we also look at adoption studies to some degree or other. It's fascinating to know or to learn that individuals who are adopted will often take on some of the characteristics of their adoptive parents, but there is no gene or genetic connection between them at all, but they will still take on certain characteristics, and people study that on a consistent basis. There are social implications related to genes. We can do prenatal screening to help identify genetic abnormalities. Individuals can then shape their environments. Genetics and the environment interact in a very complex fashion. And what this leads to is an interesting ethical question. There will come a time, and it's not too far away, when individuals will be able to turn on and turn off certain genes that then will provide certain characteristics to an unborn child. For example, if my wife and I were to have more children, which we will not, but if we were, there might come a time in the future where we could decide that we wanted a male, blonde-headed, blue-eyed boy that had other specific types of characteristics that are all related to gene as well as gene interaction, the ability to control those genes. Now, the ethical question is very simple. Is that appropriate? Again, that's something you get to decide for yourself. The human condition is moving to a place where we are able to manipulate genes in that capacity. Now, as George W. Bush also said, just because we can doesn't mean that we should necessarily. So, ending our general conversation related to biological challenges or issues related to psychology, remember that there is a specific realm of psychological study that's referred to as evolutionary psychology. It includes the study of natural selection, which is survival and reproduction of genetically well-adapted individuals. Evolutionary psychologists study how natural selection might influence the adaptive behavior and mental processes of people. So there's a lot there to digest. Just bear in mind that you've got plenty of time. If you have a specific question, please reach out, let me know, or ask it in the middle of the discussion board, and we can all tackle it for you. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.